Imagine a young woman, her body racked by convulsions, her voice, once gentle, now guttural and unrecognizable, echoing through the walls of a small German farmhouse. Imagine her parents, desperate and terrified, watching as their daughter wastes away, caught between the world of science and the shadow of something far older, darker, and more mysterious. In 1976, Anneliese Michel died after months of exorcisms, her story igniting a firestorm of controversy that still burns today. Was she possessed by demons, or was she failed by the very people meant to save her? Tonight, we unravel the chilling truth behind one of the most disturbing cases in modern history. Let us know which country you're listening from. We love to hear where these stories reach. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more true horror. Our story begins in the rolling hills of Bavaria, West Germany, in the small town of Klingenberg am Main. It's a place where the old ways linger, where Catholicism is woven into the fabric of daily life, and where the line between faith and fear can blur in the shadows. Anneliese Michel was born here on September 21, 1952, the second of 4 daughters in a devoutly religious family. Her parents, Anna and Joseph, were strict but loving, raising their children in the traditions of the church, with daily prayers and regular mass. By all accounts, Anneliese was a bright, cheerful child, studious, kind, and deeply faithful. But beneath the surface, there were cracks. The Michel family carried a heavy burden of guilt and shame. Anna, Anneliese's mother, had given birth to an illegitimate child before marrying Joseph, a scandal in their conservative community. The family's piety was, in part, a shield against judgment, a way to atone for past sins. Anneliese, sensitive and eager to please, absorbed this atmosphere of anxiety and devotion. She was a good student, popular at school, and dreamed of becoming a teacher. But as she entered adolescence, something began to change. It started with a single, inexplicable event. In 1968, at the age of 16, Anneliese experienced her first seizure. She was at school when her body suddenly stiffened, her limbs jerking uncontrollably. She remembered nothing of the episode, but her classmates were frightened. Doctors diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition that can cause not only seizures but also hallucinations, mood swings, and changes in personality. Anneliese was prescribed anticonvulsant medication and sent home, her future suddenly uncertain. For a time, the drugs seemed to help, but the seizures returned, growing more frequent and severe. Anneliese began to withdraw from her friends, her once bright spirit dimming. She complained of seeing devil faces during her prayers, of hearing voices that damned her to hell. At night, she was tormented by visions, dark figures standing at the foot of her bed, whispering blasphemies. Her family watched in helpless horror as their daughter slipped away, her body and mind besieged by forces they could not understand. Medical intervention intensified. Anneliese was admitted to a psychiatric hospital in Würzburg, where she underwent a battery of tests: EEGs, blood work, psychological evaluations. The doctors tried different medications, Dilantin, Tegretol, and later, Iolept. But nothing seemed to work. If anything, her condition worsened. She became depressed, withdrawn, and obsessed with religious themes. She began to believe she was damned, that she could never be forgiven for her sins. Her mother later recalled, "She said she was burning in hell. She begged us to help her." The Michel family was devout, but they were not superstitious. At first, they trusted the doctors, believing that science would find an answer. But as the months dragged on, and Anneliese's suffering deepened, doubt crept in. The medications did not stop the seizures. The hallucinations grew more intense. Anneliese began to avoid religious objects, crosses, holy water, even the family's rosary. She claimed that the images of saints on her bedroom wall glared at her with hatred. She tore the clothes from her body, screamed for hours, and refused to eat. Her parents, desperate and exhausted, began to wonder if something more than illness was at work. It was around this time that Anneliese's mother sought the advice of their parish priest. The church, cautious and methodical, did not rush to judgment. Exorcism, in the Catholic tradition, is a last resort, reserved for cases where all medical explanations have been exhausted. The local priest, Father Ernst Alt, was skeptical at first. He visited Anneliese, spoke with her, and observed her behavior. What he saw disturbed him deeply. In his reports, he wrote that Anneliese did not look like an epileptic. He described her as tormented, desperate, and afraid of damnation. He noted her aversion to sacred objects, her violent outbursts, and her claims of being possessed by multiple demons. Father Alt began to correspond with the Bishop of Würzburg, requesting permission to perform an exorcism. The church hesitated, insisting that Anneliese continue psychiatric treatment, but the family's faith in medicine was fading. They watched as their daughter wasted away, her body growing thin and frail, her eyes hollow with suffering. Anneliese herself began to beg for an exorcism, convinced that only the church could save her soul. By 1975, the situation had reached a breaking point. Anneliese was 23 years old, but she looked much older, her face gaunt, her body ravaged by malnutrition and self-inflicted injuries. She spoke in strange voices, sometimes deep and guttural, sometimes high and mocking. She claimed to be possessed by 6 demons, including Lucifer, Judas, Nero, Cain, Hitler, and a disgraced priest named Fleischmann. Her family, isolated and overwhelmed, clung to their faith as the only hope left. In September of that year, the bishop finally granted permission for the rite of exorcism. 2 priests were assigned to the case, Father Ernst Alt, who had advocated for Anneliese, and Father Arnold Renz, an experienced exorcist. What followed would become one of the most harrowing and controversial chapters in the history of the Catholic Church, a series of 67 exorcism sessions, recorded on tape, that would end in tragedy and ignite a debate that still rages today. As the first prayers were spoken, the line between faith and fear, science and superstition, began to blur forever. The first exorcism session took place on September 24, 1975, in the Michel family's modest home. The room was prepared according to the ancient rites, a crucifix on the wall, holy water at hand, candles flickering in the dim light. Anneliese sat in a chair, her parents and sisters nearby, their faces drawn with worry and exhaustion. Fathers Alt and Renz began with the traditional prayers, invoking the protection of the saints and the Virgin Mary. At first, Anneliese was quiet, her head bowed, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. But as the prayers intensified, something changed. Anneliese's body tensed, her breathing grew ragged, and her voice, so familiar to her family, shifted into something unrecognizable. Deep, guttural, and mocking, it hurled insults and blasphemies at the priests. The words were often in languages Anneliese had never studied: Latin, ancient Greek, even Aramaic. The priests pressed on, reciting the Roman ritual, demanding that the demons reveal themselves. Anneliese thrashed and screamed, her body contorting in ways that seemed impossible. Her parents watched in horror, torn between hope and terror. The sessions were grueling, sometimes lasting for hours. The priests recorded many of them on cassette tapes, capturing the chilling sounds of Anneliese's transformation. On the tapes, her voice shifts from pleading and desperate to mocking and violent. She curses, spits, and laughs, a sound that even decades later sends shivers down the spine of anyone who hears it. The priests ask the demons their names, and the voices respond: I am Lucifer, I am Judas, I am Hitler. Each claims a part of Anneliese's soul, each fights to remain. Outside the Michel home, life in Klingenberg continued as usual. Neighbors whispered about the strange goings-on, but few knew the full extent of what was happening behind closed doors. The family became increasingly isolated, their world shrinking to the confines of their suffering daughter's room. Anneliese's health deteriorated rapidly. She refused food and water, claiming that the demons would not allow her to eat. Her weight dropped dangerously low, her skin grew pale and bruised, and her eyes, once bright, became sunken and haunted. The priests, for their part, were caught in a terrible dilemma. They believed they were fighting for Anneliese's soul, that every session was a battle against evil itself. But they also saw the toll it was taking on her body. Father Renz later testified that he had never seen a case like this before. He described Anneliese as a battlefield, her body and mind torn apart by forces he could not fully comprehend. Father Alt, too, was deeply affected. In his diary he wrote, "I am convinced that this is not a case for a psychiatrist. This is a case for the church." Yet the medical community remained unconvinced. Anneliese's doctors continued to insist that she was suffering from a combination of epilepsy and psychosis. They warned the family that the exorcisms were making her condition worse, that she needed hospitalization and proper care. But the Michels, desperate and afraid, clung to the hope that the church could succeed where medicine had failed. They watched as Anneliese's suffering grew more intense, her body wasting away, her mind slipping further from reality. The exorcism sessions became more frequent, sometimes occurring twice a week. Each time, the priests would begin with prayers and hymns, invoking the power of Christ to drive out the demons. Anneliese would resist, sometimes violently, lashing out at those around her. She bit, scratched, and struck her family and the priests, her strength seemingly superhuman despite her frail appearance. She spoke in multiple voices, each with its own personality and mannerisms. The priests recorded these voices, later presenting the tapes as evidence of possession, but not everyone was convinced. Some members of the church hierarchy questioned the wisdom of continuing the exorcisms. They worried about the legal and ethical implications, about the possibility of harm coming to Anneliese. The Bishop of Würzburg, who had authorized the rites, insisted that all medical treatments continue alongside the exorcisms. But by this point, Anneliese was refusing medication, convinced that it was part of the demon's plan to keep her soul in torment. As the weeks passed, Anneliese's condition grew ever more dire. She developed open sores on her knees from repeated genuflections, hundreds each day, performed as acts of penance. She tore at her own flesh, bit into the wall, and licked up her own urine from the floor. Her family, overwhelmed and exhausted, could do little but pray and hope for a miracle. The priests, too, were reaching the limits of their endurance. Father Renz later described the sessions as a descent into hell, each one more harrowing than the last. Yet through it all, there were moments of clarity. Brief flashes when Anneliese seemed to return to herself. She would thank her family, apologize for her behavior, and beg them not to give up on her. She spoke of visions, of the Virgin Mary, of angels and saints, of battles between good and evil raging within her soul. She believed that her suffering had a purpose, that she was being called to atone for the sins of others. In her rare lucid moments, she asked her family to pray for her, to trust in God's plan. The tapes from these sessions remain some of the most disturbing evidence in the case. In one, Anneliese's voice shifts rapidly between personalities, each one claiming to be a different demon. The priests demand that they leave her body, but the voices laugh and taunt them. "We will not go," one growls. "She belongs to us." The sound of Anneliese's screams, her desperate pleas for help, and the relentless prayers of the priests create an atmosphere of almost unbearable tension. By the spring of 1976, Anneliese was near death. She weighed less than 70 pounds, her body ravaged by malnutrition and self-inflicted injuries. Her parents, racked with guilt and fear, continued to believe that the exorcisms were her only hope. The priests, too, pressed on, convinced that they were fighting a battle for her soul. But outside the walls of the Michel home, questions were beginning to mount. Neighbors, doctors, and even some within the church wondered how much longer this could go on, and whether anyone would survive the ordeal. The line between faith and madness, between salvation and destruction, was growing ever thinner. And as the final weeks approached, the true horror of Anneliese Michel's story was only just beginning to unfold. As spring gave way to summer, the Michel household became a place of perpetual twilight. Curtains were drawn to keep out the curious eyes of neighbors and the harsh light that seemed to agitate Anneliese further. The air inside was thick with incense, the scent of burning candles, and the ever-present tension of a family on the edge. The exorcism sessions, now numbering in the dozens, had become a grim routine, each one a test of endurance for everyone involved. Anneliese's physical state was deteriorating rapidly. She was emaciated, her cheeks hollow, her skin stretched tight over her bones. Her once lustrous hair had become brittle and thin. She could barely walk, yet during the exorcisms, she would sometimes display bursts of energy that defied explanation. Witnesses described her leaping onto chairs, growling, and contorting her body in ways that seemed impossible for someone so weak. Her knees were swollen and bleeding from constant kneeling and genuflecting, sometimes hundreds of times in a single day. The priests, Fathers Alt and Renz, kept meticulous records of each session. They noted the times, the prayers used, and the responses from Anneliese and the supposed demons. The tapes they recorded captured not only the disturbing voices but also the exhaustion and desperation in the room. On one tape, Father Renz can be heard pleading, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you, unclean spirit, to leave this child of God." The response is a guttural laugh, followed by a string of obscenities. The voices sometimes argued with each other, each claiming dominion over Anneliese's soul. The content of these tapes would later become a focal point in the trial, but at the time they served as a kind of proof for the family and the priests, a record of the battle they believed they were fighting. For Anneliese, the sessions were both torture and hope. She oscillated between moments of lucidity, where she begged for the exorcisms to continue, and periods of agony, where she pleaded for death. She told her mother, "I want to suffer for others. I want to atone for their sins." Her faith, twisted by her illness and the relentless rituals, became a source of both comfort and torment. Outside the Michel home, the world was changing. The 1970s in Germany were a time of social upheaval, with old traditions clashing against modern science and skepticism. The Catholic Church, too, was under scrutiny, its ancient rites questioned by a new generation of believers and non-believers alike. The Michel case, though still largely hidden from public view, was already beginning to attract attention. Local doctors, frustrated by the family's refusal to hospitalize Anneliese, began to voice their concerns more forcefully. One physician, Dr. Richard Roth, visited the Michel home and was shocked by what he saw. He later testified that Anneliese was in a state of extreme emaciation and that her condition was life-threatening. Yet, despite these warnings, the exorcisms continued. The family, convinced that medical science had failed them, placed all their hope in the church. The priests, too, felt a growing sense of responsibility. They believed that to stop the exorcisms would be to abandon Anneliese to the demons that tormented her. The sessions became more intense, the prayers more desperate. Anneliese's screams echoed through the house, sometimes audible to neighbors passing by on the quiet country road. The psychological toll on the family was immense. Anna Michel, Anneliese's mother, spent her days caring for her daughter, cleaning her wounds, and praying for her salvation. Joseph, her father, grew increasingly withdrawn, haunted by guilt and helplessness. Anneliese's sisters, too, were affected. One later described the atmosphere in the house as unbearable, a place where hope and fear coexisted in equal measure. As the weeks wore on, Anneliese's visions became more vivid and terrifying. She described seeing the Virgin Mary, who told her that her suffering would end soon and that she would become a martyr for others. She claimed to see angels and demons fighting over her soul, and she spoke of a black mass being held in her honor by the forces of evil. These visions, whether the product of her illness or something more, only deepened the family's conviction that they were witnessing a genuine case of possession. The priests, too, were not immune to doubt. In private, Father Alt confided to colleagues that he sometimes wondered if they were doing the right thing. He wrote in his diary, "I pray for guidance every day. I fear for Anneliese, but I also fear for us." Father Renz, more stoic, pressed on with the rituals, convinced that they were close to a breakthrough. He believed that the demons were weakening, that Anneliese's suffering would soon be over. But the reality was far more grim. Anneliese's body was shutting down. She could no longer eat or drink without vomiting, and her weight dropped to dangerous levels. Her wounds became infected, and she developed a high fever. Yet even in this state, she insisted on continuing the exorcisms. She told her parents, "I must go through with this. It is my duty." By June 1976, the end was near. The final exorcism sessions were marked by a sense of desperation and impending doom. The priests prayed with renewed fervor, the family wept and pleaded, and Anneliese, barely conscious, whispered prayers of her own. On June 30th, the last session was held. Anneliese, too weak to rise from her bed, uttered her final words. "Mother, I'm afraid." She died the next morning, July 1st, 1976, at the age of 23. The official cause of death was malnutrition and dehydration. Anneliese weighed just 68 pounds. Her body bore the marks of her ordeal, bruises, sores, and broken teeth. The horror of her final months was now impossible to hide. The authorities were called, and an investigation was launched. The Michel case, once a private tragedy, was about to become a national scandal. The world would soon learn the chilling details of what had happened in that quiet Bavarian farmhouse. And the debate over faith, science, and the limits of human suffering was only just beginning. The morning of July 1st, 1976, dawned gray and silent over Klingenberg. The Michel family, numb with grief and exhaustion, sat in stunned silence as the reality of Anneliese's death settled over the house. Anna Michel, her mother, wept quietly at her daughter's bedside, clutching the rosary that had been a constant companion through months of suffering. Joseph, her father, stared blankly at the wall, his hands trembling. The priests, Fathers Alt and Renz, knelt in prayer, their faces drawn with sorrow and doubt. For a brief moment, the house was still, a silence broken only by the distant tolling of church bells. But outside, the world was already beginning to take notice. The local physician, Dr. Roth, who had visited Anneliese in her final days, was the first to raise the alarm. He had seen the state of her body, the open wounds, the extreme emaciation, and he knew that something was terribly wrong. He notified the authorities, and soon the police arrived at the Michel home. The sight that greeted them was shocking. A young woman, barely more than a skeleton, lying dead in her childhood bed, surrounded by religious icons and the remnants of a desperate battle. An autopsy was ordered. The results were grim. Anneliese Michel had died of starvation and dehydration. She weighed just 68 pounds. Her knees were broken from constant genuflections, her body covered in bruises, sores, and lesions. There was no evidence of physical restraint. Her suffering had been self-inflicted, driven by a mind and spirit in torment. The pathologists found no trace of medication in her system, despite the prescriptions she had been given. The official report concluded that Anneliese's death could have been prevented, if only she had received proper medical care. News of the case spread quickly, first through the small town, then across Germany, and finally around the world. The media descended on Klingenberg, their cameras and microphones capturing the grief and confusion of a community in shock. Headlines screamed of exorcism death and possessed girl starved. The story became a sensation, a lightning rod for debates about faith, science, and the limits of religious authority. The authorities moved swiftly. Anna and Joseph Michel, along with Fathers Alt and Renz, were charged with negligent homicide. The prosecution argued that they had allowed Anneliese to die, refusing her the medical care that could have saved her life. The defense, meanwhile, insisted that the family and priests had acted out of love and faith, believing that they were fighting for Anneliese's soul. The stage was set for one of the most controversial trials in German history. The trial began in March 1978 in the city of Aschaffenburg. The courtroom was packed with journalists, curious onlookers, and supporters from both sides of the debate. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, medical records, autopsy reports, and the testimony of doctors who had treated Anneliese. They argued that her symptoms, seizures, hallucinations, self-harm, were consistent with epilepsy and psychosis, not demonic possession. They pointed to the lack of food and water, the refusal of medication, and the relentless exorcisms as the true causes of her death. The defense countered with a very different narrative. They called witnesses who described Anneliese's aversion to religious objects, her strange voices, and her superhuman strength during the exorcisms. They played the tapes recorded by Fathers Alt and Renz, filling the courtroom with the chilling sounds of Anneliese's screams and the guttural voices that claimed to be demons. The defense argued that the family and priests had exhausted all medical options, turning to exorcism only as a last resort. They insisted that Anneliese herself had begged for the rituals, convinced that she was possessed. The tapes became a focal point of the trial. Jurors listened in silence as the voices shifted from pleading to mocking, from desperate to defiant. The sounds were haunting, evidence, the defense claimed, of a reality that science could not explain. But the prosecution dismissed them as the ravings of a deeply disturbed young woman, her mind fractured by illness and relentless religious pressure. Expert witnesses were called from both sides. Psychiatrists testified that Anneliese suffered from a combination of temporal lobe epilepsy and psychotic depression, conditions that could explain her visions, voices, and behavior. They argued that the exorcisms had only reinforced her delusions, driving her deeper into madness. But theologians and exorcists from the church insisted that the case was unique, that the symptoms went beyond anything seen in ordinary mental illness. They pointed to the knowledge of ancient languages, the aversion to sacred objects, and the physical phenomena as signs of genuine possession. The trial was a spectacle, a clash of worldviews played out before a fascinated public. The media coverage was relentless, with newspapers and television programs dissecting every detail. Some saw the case as a tragic example of religious fanaticism, a young woman destroyed by superstition and neglect. Others saw it as a battle between good and evil, a martyrdom in the modern age. Letters poured in from around the world, some offering prayers, others demanding justice. For the Michel family, the trial was a second ordeal. Anna and Joseph sat in the courtroom, their faces etched with grief and guilt. They spoke of their love for Anneliese, their desperate hope that the exorcisms would save her. They described her suffering, her pleas for help, and their belief that they had done everything possible. Fathers Alt and Renz, too, defended their actions, insisting that they had acted in accordance with their faith and the teachings of the church. The verdict, when it came, was both a condemnation and a mercy. All 4 defendants were found guilty of negligent homicide, but the judge acknowledged that they had acted out of sincere belief, not malice. Anna and Joseph Michel were sentenced to 6 months in prison, suspended, and 3 years probation. Fathers Alt and Renz received similar sentences. The judge's words echoed the moral complexity of the case. They have suffered enough. But the questions raised by Anneliese Michel's death would not be so easily answered. The trial had exposed deep rifts in German society, between faith and reason, tradition and progress, belief and doubt. The tapes, the testimony, and the haunting image of a young woman lost between 2 worlds would linger in the public imagination for years to come. And as the dust settled, the debate over what really happened to Anneliese Michel was only just beginning. In the aftermath of the trial, the small town of Klingenberg became a place of uneasy silence. The Michel family retreated from public view, their home now a symbol of tragedy and controversy. The church, too, was shaken. The case had forced uncomfortable questions into the open, about the power of faith, the limits of science, and the responsibilities of those who claim to heal the soul. For many, the most haunting legacy of the Anneliese Michel case was the audio evidence left behind. The tapes, recorded during the 67 exorcism sessions, became infamous. They circulated among journalists, theologians, and the curious, each listener searching for answers in the cacophony of voices. On these recordings, Anneliese's voice shifts from her natural gentle tone to something guttural and inhuman. She growls, snarls, and sometimes speaks in languages she had never studied. The voices claimed to be Lucifer, Judas, Nero, Cain, Hitler, and the disgraced priest Fleischmann. Each voice is distinct, each one taunting the priests and resisting their prayers. For believers, these tapes were proof of the supernatural. They pointed to the knowledge of ancient languages, the aversion to holy objects, and the physical phenomena as evidence that Anneliese was truly possessed. Some theologians argued that her case was a rare but genuine example of demonic possession, a warning that evil still walks among us. They saw her suffering as a form of martyrdom, a sacrifice made for the sins of others. Pilgrims began to visit her grave, leaving flowers, rosaries, and handwritten notes asking for her intercession. But for skeptics, the tapes told a different story. Psychiatrists and neurologists who reviewed the recordings heard the unmistakable signs of mental illness, delusions, dissociation, and the effects of extreme psychological stress. They pointed out that temporal lobe epilepsy can cause intense religious experiences, hallucinations, and changes in personality. The ability to mimic different voices, they argued, was not evidence of possession, but a symptom of a fractured mind. The knowledge of ancient languages could be explained by Anneliese's religious upbringing and exposure to Latin in church. The aversion to holy objects, they said, was a manifestation of her internal conflict, her faith twisted by illness into a source of terror. The debate raged on, fueled by the media and the growing fascination with the occult in popular culture. Books, articles, and documentaries dissected every aspect of the case. Some portrayed Anneliese as a victim of religious fanaticism, a young woman destroyed by the very faith that was meant to save her. Others saw her as a tragic figure caught between two worlds, her suffering a mystery that defied easy explanation. In the years that followed, the Michel family struggled to find peace. Anna and Joseph visited Anneliese's grave regularly, tending to the flowers and praying for her soul. They received letters from strangers, some offering sympathy, others condemning them for their role in her death. The weight of guilt and grief was immense. Anna later said, "We only wanted to help her. We never wanted this." The priests, too, were marked by the experience. Father Alt, already a man of deep faith, became more withdrawn, haunted by doubts about whether he had done the right thing. He continued to serve as a priest but rarely spoke of the case. Father Renz, meanwhile, defended the exorcisms until his death, insisting that they had followed the church's teachings and acted out of compassion. Both men carried the scars of those months in Klingenberg, a burden that would never fully lift. The Catholic Church, faced with public scrutiny, launched its own investigation. The Vatican reaffirmed that exorcism should only be performed in the rarest of cases and always alongside medical treatment. New guidelines were issued, emphasizing the importance of psychiatric evaluation and the need for caution. The Church did not officially recognize Anneliese's possession, but neither did it dismiss the possibility. The ambiguity only fueled further debate. For the medical community, the case became a cautionary tale. Doctors and psychiatrists pointed to Anneliese's death as a tragic example of what can happen when mental illness is misunderstood or ignored. They called for better education, more resources, and a greater willingness to confront the stigma surrounding psychiatric disorders. The Michel case was cited in medical journals and conferences as a reminder of the dangers of neglecting science in favor of superstition. Yet, for all the analysis and argument, the central mystery of Anneliese Michel's life and death remained unresolved. Those who listened to the tapes, who read the court transcripts and studied the photographs, were left with a sense of unease. The facts were clear. Anneliese died of starvation, her body ravaged by months of suffering. But the meaning of her suffering, the true nature of what happened in that farmhouse, was less certain. Some saw in her story a warning about the dangers of religious extremism, the power of belief to shape reality for better or worse. Others saw a failure of the medical system, a young woman lost because those around her could not agree on how to help. And still others saw a mystery that defied explanation, a glimpse into the darkness that sometimes lies just beyond the reach of reason. In the years after her death, Anneliese's grave became a place of pilgrimage. People came from across Germany and beyond, drawn by the story of the possessed girl. Some came seeking miracles, others answers. The grave itself was simple: a white cross, a photograph of Anneliese, and the words "Ruhe in Gott," rest in God. Flowers and candles were left in tribute, and sometimes late at night, visitors claimed to feel a presence, a sense of peace or unease that lingered long after they had gone. The Michel family, for their part, tried to move on. They rarely spoke to the press, preferring to let Anneliese's memory rest. But the questions raised by her death continued to echo, through the church, the courts, and the hearts of all who heard her story. And as the years passed, the legend of Anneliese Michel only grew, her life and death becoming a symbol of the eternal struggle between faith and doubt, hope and despair, light and darkness. As the decades passed, the story of Anneliese Michel refused to fade into obscurity. Instead, it became a touchstone for debates about the boundaries of belief and the responsibilities of those who care for the vulnerable. In Germany, the case was discussed in classrooms, churches, and psychiatric conferences. Internationally, it inspired books, films, and countless articles, each retelling adding new layers of interpretation, speculation, and myth. For some, Anneliese's ordeal was a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious zealotry. They saw in her story the tragic consequences of a community unable to reconcile faith with science, of a family and clergy so desperate for a spiritual explanation that they overlooked the clear signs of mental illness. In this view, Anneliese was a victim not of demons, but of a system that failed to protect her. A young woman whose suffering was compounded by misunderstanding and misplaced trust. Yet for others, the case remained a profound mystery. The tapes, the eyewitness accounts, and the sheer intensity of Anneliese's symptoms seemed to defy easy explanation. Some theologians and exorcists argued that her case was unique, a rare instance where the supernatural broke through the veil of the ordinary. They pointed to the knowledge of hidden things, the aversion to sacred objects, and the physical phenomena as evidence that something more than illness was at work. For these believers, Anneliese's suffering was not meaningless. It was a battle between good and evil, played out in the most intimate and terrifying way. The Catholic Church, caught in the crossfire, responded with caution. In the years following the trial, the Vatican issued new guidelines for exorcism, emphasizing the need for thorough medical and psychiatric evaluation before any rite could be performed. The Church reaffirmed that exorcism was a last resort, to be used only when all natural explanations had been exhausted. Priests were instructed to work closely with doctors and to approach claims of possession with skepticism and care. The Michel case became a required study for exorcists in training, a reminder of the grave responsibility that comes with confronting the unknown. Meanwhile, the medical community used Anneliese's story as a rallying cry for reform. Psychiatrists and neurologists called for better education about the symptoms of epilepsy and psychosis, and for greater collaboration between medical professionals and religious leaders. The case was cited in textbooks and conferences as an example of the dangers of dualistic thinking, the belief that mind and body, science and spirit, are separate realms. For many doctors, Anneliese's death was a preventable tragedy, a lesson in the importance of compassion, communication, and evidence-based care. But for the Michel family, and for those who had witnessed Anneliese's suffering firsthand, the questions were far more personal. Anna and Joseph Michel, though devastated by the loss of their daughter, never wavered in their belief that they had done the right thing. They spoke of Anneliese's faith, her courage, and her conviction that her suffering had meaning. In rare interviews, Anna described the final days of her daughter's life, the prayers, the visions, the moments of lucidity and despair. She insisted that Anneliese had chosen her path, that she had begged for the exorcisms, and that she had found peace in the end. The priests, too, carried the weight of the case for the rest of their lives. Father Alt, haunted by doubt and grief, withdrew from public ministry, spending his remaining years in quiet contemplation. He wrote in his private journals of the dark night of the soul, of the struggle to reconcile faith with the suffering he had witnessed. Father Renz, more steadfast, continued to defend the exorcisms, insisting that they had followed the Church's teachings and acted out of love. Both men died without ever fully escaping the shadow of Klingenberg. For those who listened to the tapes, who read the court transcripts and studied the photographs, the story of Anneliese Michel remained a source of unease. The facts were clear. Her death was the result of starvation and neglect. But the meaning of her suffering, the true nature of what happened in that farmhouse, was less certain. Was she a martyr, a victim, or something else entirely? The question lingered, unresolved. In the years that followed, Anneliese's grave became a site of pilgrimage. People came from across Germany and beyond, drawn by the story of the possessed girl. Some came seeking miracles, others answers. The grave itself was simple: a white cross, a photograph of Anneliese, and the words "Ruhe in Gott," rest in God. Flowers and candles were left in tribute, and sometimes, late at night, visitors claimed to feel a presence, a sense of peace or unease that lingered long after they had gone. The legend of Anneliese Michel grew, fueled by the fascination with the occult and the supernatural that swept through popular culture in the late 20th century. Her story inspired films like The Exorcism of Emily Rose, which dramatized her ordeal for a new generation. Books and documentaries explored every aspect of the case, from the medical diagnoses to the theological debates. Each retelling added new details, new interpretations, and new questions. Yet beneath the layers of myth and speculation, the real Anneliese Michel remained elusive. A young woman caught between worlds, her life and death a testament to the complexity of human suffering. For some, she was a warning about the dangers of unchecked belief. For others, she was a symbol of faith in the face of unimaginable darkness. For all who heard her story, she was a reminder that the line between the natural and the supernatural, the explainable and the mysterious, is often thinner than we care to admit. As the years passed, the debates continued. Was Anneliese Michel possessed, or was she ill? Did the exorcisms help her, or did they hasten her death? Was her suffering meaningful, or was it a senseless tragedy? The answers, if they exist, remain hidden, locked away in the memories of those who knew her, in the tapes that captured her final days, and in the silence that lingers over her grave. And so the story of Anneliese Michel endures, a chilling reminder of the power of belief, the limits of understanding, and the mysteries that still haunt the human soul. In the decades since Anneliese Michel's death, her story has continued to ripple outward, touching lives and stirring debate far beyond the quiet fields of Klingenberg. Each year, new generations discover her case, some through the chilling audio tapes, others through dramatizations, and many through the persistent questions that her ordeal left behind. The world has changed since 1976, but the uneasy fascination with her suffering remains. For the Catholic Church, the Michel case became a turning point. In the years following the trial, German dioceses grew far more cautious about authorizing exorcisms. The Vatican's revised guidelines, issued in 1999, required that all cases of alleged possession be thoroughly investigated by medical and psychiatric professionals before any rite could be considered. The Church emphasized that true possession was exceedingly rare and that most cases could be explained by natural causes. Priests were instructed to work in close cooperation with doctors and to treat claims of possession with skepticism and compassion. Yet, the demand for exorcisms did not disappear. In fact, reports of possession and requests for exorcism increased in some parts of the world, fueled by media coverage and the enduring power of stories like Anneliese's. The Church responded by training a new generation of exorcists, but always with the warning that discernment and caution must come first. The Michel case was cited in seminars and training sessions as a sobering example of what can go wrong when faith and science fail to work together. In Germany, The legal and medical communities also took lessons from the tragedy. The case prompted renewed discussion about the rights of patients, the responsibilities of caregivers, and the need for clear communication between families, doctors, and religious authorities. Medical schools used Anneliese's story as a case study in the dangers of misdiagnosis and the importance of respecting both the physical and psychological needs of patients. The law, too, was clarified. While religious freedom is protected, it does not extend to practices that endanger life or health. But for many, the most enduring legacy of the Anneliese Michel case is not found in legal codes or church documents, but in the personal stories of those who have been touched by her ordeal. Over the years, countless people have written to the Michel family, to the priests, and to journalists who covered the case. Some share their own experiences of suffering, faith, and doubt. Others seek answers, hoping that Anneliese's story might shed light on their own struggles. A few claim to have experienced miracles at her grave, or to have been inspired by her courage and faith. Among these voices are both believers and skeptics. Some see Anneliese as a martyr, a young woman who suffered for the sins of others and whose faith never wavered, even in the face of unimaginable torment. They point to her visions, her knowledge of hidden things, and the chilling voices captured on tape as evidence that her case was unique, a true battle between good and evil. For these believers, Anneliese's story is a call to faith, a reminder that the supernatural is real and that evil must be confronted even at great personal cost. Others, however, see her as a victim, not of demons, but of misunderstanding, isolation, and the tragic consequences of untreated mental illness. They argue that Anneliese's symptoms were consistent with known medical conditions, and that her suffering was made worse by the relentless exorcisms and the pressure to conform to religious expectations. For these skeptics, her story is a warning about the dangers of superstition, the need for compassion, and the importance of trusting in science and reason. The tapes themselves remain a source of fascination and horror. For those who listen, the experience is deeply unsettling. The voices that emerge from the crackling recordings are not easily dismissed. They are anguished, mocking, and at times, heartbreakingly human. Some listeners report feeling a chill, a sense of unease that lingers long after the tape has ended. Others are moved to tears by the sound of Anneliese's suffering, her desperate pleas for help, and the prayers of her family and priests. In the years since her death, Anneliese's grave has become a place of pilgrimage. Visitors come from all over the world, leaving flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. Some pray for her intercession, believing that she has a special place in heaven. Others come seeking answers, hoping to find some meaning in the tragedy that unfolded in that quiet farmhouse so many years ago. The grave itself is simple, but the atmosphere is charged with emotion, a testament to the enduring power of her story. The Michel family, for their part, has remained largely silent in the years since the trial. They have chosen to grieve in private, tending to Anneliese's grave and honoring her memory in their own way. Occasionally, they have spoken to journalists or visitors, always emphasizing their love for Anneliese and their belief that they did what they thought was right. The pain of their loss is still evident, but so too is their faith, a faith that has been tested but not broken. For the wider world, the story of Anneliese Michel continues to provoke reflection and debate. It raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of suffering, the limits of human understanding, and the ways in which belief can both heal and harm. It challenges us to consider how we respond to those in pain, and whether we are willing to confront the mysteries that lie at the edge of our knowledge. As the years pass, the legend of Anneliese Michel only grows. Her life and death have become a symbol, a mirror in which we see our own fears, hopes, and uncertainties reflected. Whether we view her as a martyr, a victim, or a mystery, her story endures, haunting the collective imagination and reminding us that some questions may never be fully answered. And so, the chilling truth behind Anneliese Michel's exorcism story remains, a tale of faith and doubt, of suffering and hope, of darkness and the search for light. The echoes of her ordeal continue to reverberate, challenging us to look deeper, to question more, and to remember the human being at the heart of the horror. In the years since Anneliese Michel's death, the world has not forgotten her. Her story has become a touchstone for debates about faith, science, and the limits of human understanding. The farmhouse in Klingenberg stands quiet now, its walls no longer echoing with prayers or screams, but the questions raised within those rooms continue to haunt us. The aftermath of the case rippled through Germany and beyond. In the legal realm, the trial of Anneliese's parents and priests set a precedent. Religious freedom, while protected, does not excuse neglect or the denial of medical care. The verdict sent a clear message: belief cannot override the duty to protect life. In the years that followed, German law was clarified to ensure that the rights of patients, especially those suffering from mental illness, would be safeguarded. Medical professionals were encouraged to intervene more assertively when religious practices threatened a person's health or safety. Within the Catholic Church, the Michel case became a somber lesson. The Vatican's revised guidelines for exorcism, issued in 1999, were shaped in part by the tragedy in Klingenberg. The Church reaffirmed that exorcism is a rare and extraordinary measure, to be considered only after exhaustive medical and psychiatric evaluation. Priests were instructed to approach claims of possession with humility and caution, and to work closely with doctors and mental health professionals. The Church's stance became one of careful discernment, balancing respect for spiritual suffering with the realities of modern medicine. Yet, the debate has never truly ended. For every skeptic who sees Anneliese's death as a preventable tragedy, there is a believer who finds in her story evidence of the supernatural. The tapes of her exorcisms, the testimony of her family and priests, and the enduring mystery of her symptoms continue to fuel speculation. Was Anneliese Michel possessed, or was she desperately ill? Did the exorcisms offer hope, or did they hasten her decline? The answers remain elusive, shaped as much by personal belief as by the facts of the case. The cultural impact of Anneliese's story has been profound. Her life and death have inspired films, books, and documentaries, each retelling adding new layers of interpretation and myth. The Exorcism of Emily Rose, released in 2005, brought her ordeal to a global audience, blending horror with courtroom drama and reigniting debate about the nature of evil and the power of faith. For some, these portrayals are a way to process the horror of what happened. For others, they risk sensationalizing a real and tragic life. But beyond the headlines and the Hollywood scripts, there remains the reality of a young woman who suffered deeply. Those who knew Anneliese remember her not as a symbol, but as a daughter, a sister, a friend. Her letters and diaries reveal a person of intelligence, sensitivity, and profound faith, a young woman who longed for meaning and struggled with forces she could not control. In her rare lucid moments, she expressed gratitude to her family and priests, and a hope that her suffering might serve a greater purpose. For the medical community, Anneliese's case is a reminder of the importance of compassion and vigilance. It underscores the need for better understanding of mental illness and for collaboration between doctors, families, and spiritual leaders. The tragedy in Klingenberg is cited in medical ethics courses and psychiatric conferences as a warning. When belief and science are at odds, it is the vulnerable who suffer most. For the Church, the case remains a source of humility and caution. The priests who performed the exorcisms, Fathers Alt and Renz, went to their graves convinced that they had done what was right, but also burdened by the outcome. The Church's official position remains one of careful discernment, always seeking to balance the spiritual needs of the faithful with the demands of reason and care. For the Michel family, the pain of loss has never fully healed. They have chosen to grieve in private, tending to Anneliese's grave and honoring her memory in their own way. The grave itself has become a place of pilgrimage, visited by those seeking miracles, answers, or simply a moment of reflection. Some leave flowers and prayers, others leave notes asking for Anneliese's intercession. The site is quiet, but charged with emotion, a testament to the enduring power of her story. And for the world, Anneliese Michel's life and death remain a mystery that resists easy explanation. Her story challenges us to confront the limits of our understanding, to question the boundaries between faith and science, and to remember the human cost of our convictions. It is a story that evokes fear, empathy, and moral discomfort. A story that lingers in the mind long after the final words have been spoken. In the end, perhaps the most chilling truth is not what happened to Anneliese Michel, but what her story reveals about us. Our need to find meaning in suffering, our fear of the unknown, our willingness to believe in forces beyond our control. These are the threads that bind her story to our own. Whether we see her as a martyr, a victim, or a mystery, we are left with questions that have no easy answers. As we close this chapter, let us remember Anneliese Michel not just as a case, but as a person, a young woman whose life was marked by faith, suffering, and the search for hope. Her story is a mirror, reflecting our deepest fears and our highest aspirations. It is a reminder that the line between darkness and light is often thin, and that the search for truth is never without cost. In the words of one of Anneliese's final prayers, recorded in a moment of clarity amid the chaos, "I want to do what is right. I want to trust in God. I want to be free." May we all find the courage to seek truth, to show compassion, and to remember those who suffer in silence. Thank you for listening. If Anneliese's story has moved you, let us know your thoughts in the comments. And wherever you are in the world, may you find peace, and never stop questioning what lies just beyond the edge of understanding.